There are hundreds of basic and alternate recipes in Satisfactory 1.0. Some of them are absolutely amazing, whilst others not so much. So I've made it my mission in Satisfactory to compare every single recipe in the game to inform you guys on what the best and worst recipes are. So welcome to the best recipes in Satisfactory 1.0 series. Today's video is all about the rotors. As we'll discuss in just a minute, there's 3 main recipes for the rotors. They're also used to make quite a lot of important stuff such as motors, smart plates, turbo motors, uranium fuel rods, as well as a bunch of other items as well. It's safe to say that rotors are very important. There's 3 main recipes for the rotors. There's the basic recipe, which requires the iron rods and the screws. There's then one of the first alternate recipes, which is the copper rotor, which requires copper sheets and screws. And lastly, there is the steel rotor that requires steel pipe and wire. I have laid out all 3 of these recipes, and I've also included a bonus recipe as well, which I'll touch on a bit later on. Having said that, let's start with the basic rotor recipe, where again, we're making 10 rotors per minute. To make this, you are going to be needing 50 iron rods per minute and 250 screws per minute. Luckily, going over here to the iron rods, this ratio is extremely simple. To make the 50 iron rods, you are going to need 50 iron ingots. And to make these 50 iron ingots, you're then going to need 50 iron ore. It's a 1:1:1 ratio if you just use the basic recipes, but there's something else you can try to use. And that's because we've got the refinery. So to make our 50 iron ingots, rather than using 50 iron ore, we only have to consume about 27 iron ore per minute. That's because we're also getting water involved as well. You can also do this for caterium, copper, iron, of course, pure quartz crystals, and concrete. For all these recipes I've just mentioned, you save on the raw resource that you're trying to use, but it requires water. Some obvious points to mention though is that the refineries are a lot bigger than a smelter or a constructor or a foundry, so do bear that in mind when you are trying to plan out a factory. Also, these things do consume more power. You also have to place down water extractors which consume more resources and more power. You have to try and find a way to belt it or pipe it to your refineries, so do bear all this in mind for the refinery, but if you want to save on resources, this thing is fantastic to do so. In fact, it's so good, I've got an entire video recommending it. For this example though, I've kept things nice and basic so that newer players who haven't unlocked the refinery just yet can follow along. However, I have added one alternate recipe, and again, regular viewers of the channel will know exactly what this is, and it's to do with the screws. As you can see, we're almost missing a step here. We're going from our iron ingots straight into our screws. Normally you go from iron ingots to iron rods, then you convert the iron rods into the screws. Except if you use the cast screw alternate recipe, you don't need to do that. There are 3 different ways to make screws in total. The regular recipe, which involves the iron rods. We then have the cast screw alternate, which I very highly recommend. It's one of the best recipes in Satisfactory. And then we have steel screws, which means that you can produce 650 screws per minute at a fully overclocked constructor, but you do need steel beams for this. And then steel beams mostly just requires steel, which is iron and cord, and I don't really want to get that involved with this. So in total, the only resource you require is 112.5 iron ore per minute. And then using just 4 smelters, you can then convert all of that into your iron ingots. Very quickly, I've made a bunch of videos like this already on the channel before that gives you the best recipes in Satisfactory. If you want to see more of them, make sure you are subscribed. It massively supports the channel. Anyway, back to the video. To make your iron rods, you are going to need 4 constructors, and to make your screws, you are then going to need 5 constructors. That's 9 constructors in total, 4 smelters and 1 miner. And then when it comes to the assemblers, you're going to need 3 assemblers. Because as we can see, 1 assembler at 100% clock speed makes 4 rotors per minute. So you have to have 2 at 100% clock speed, then 1 at 50% clock speed in order to try and get your 10 per minute. Moving on now to our second recipe, which is called copper rotor. It's called copper rotor because it requires copper, who would have guessed it? So for this recipe, let's start with the screws. You only need 174 screws per minute. This is 76 screws less than our basic recipe, meaning you end up saving on some iron ore. We're also going to be using copper sheets for this. This is where things start to get a little bit interesting here. And that's because the example I'm currently showing you is the basic copper sheet recipe. To make the 20 copper sheets, you are going to need 40 copper ingots. For those 40 copper ingots, you then need 40 copper ore, and essentially, that is it. Do you guys remember the refinery from earlier? Well, using that refinery, we can make this recipe rather interesting. Because with our copper sheets, we can combine our copper ingots with water. So rather than using 40 copper ingots, we only have to use 20. And then again, to make our copper ingots, we can use the pure copper ingot recipe, which only requires 8 copper ore mixed in with some water. So rather than using the 40 copper ore from earlier, now we are only using 8, which again is a huge save on resources. But now we've got a liquid involved, and we've got 2 different sets of refineries. This is not cheap at all. It's also going to require a lot more power. So if you're trying to save on resources, this might be a good copper sheet recipe. But if you're trying to save on power and space, and if you don't really want to get a liquid involved, then just stick with the regular rotor, or copper rotor recipe. In total, these are the resources we are consuming. 43.5 iron ore and 40 copper ore. This is a lot less iron than what we were using before, and in regards to the copper, we're still not really using that much. In my opinion, it's so much easier to gather ores from just one type of item like iron or copper or limestone, rather than having to combine things like copper, limestone, coal, just to try and create one thing. That's the reason as to why in a lot of my best recipe videos, it often comes down to what resource am I using the least amount. Is that thing still attacking me? Man, I'm trying to record a video. So on paper, this looks really good. Whereas for this recipe, which yes, consumes more iron, it's so much easier to set up because all you need is just one iron node. Regardless, let's move on to steel rotors, and I know what you're probably thinking, this recipe is terrible, never ever use it. But I'm a YouTuber, so I'm going to give my 2 cents in the situation regardless. So let's start with the wire. And if you're just using the basic wire recipe, to craft the 60 wire, you're going to need 30 copper ingots. For the 30 copper ingots, you then need 30 copper ore. Of course, we've already discussed different ways that you can use this from the pure copper ingot recipe, but there's also something with the wire which we'll talk about in just a moment. Secondly, we have got our steel pipe recipe. As we're going to be needing 20 of these per minute, that then means we are going to need 30 steel ingots per minute, which requires coal and iron. So you're using the least amount of copper, the least amount of iron by far, and also a little bit of coal. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier. Have you got an iron and a copper and a coal node nearby? Because 9 out of 10 times, just finding one node is so much easier than belting all 3 of these nodes together. So like mentioned, those are our 3 main recipes to craft the rotors. But there's still one more example I would like to give over here. And that is the steel rotor recipe, the exact same recipe that I've just shown you, except with some alternate recipes. And as you can see, it's a lot simpler to make. To craft our 10 rotors per minute, we are using something called iron wire. If you haven't seen this video on screen, I highly recommend that you give it a watch, because it kind of goes over something rather similar, and that's also rather cool as well. If you didn't know, there's 3 ways that you can make wire in Satisfactory, using copper ingots, iron ingots, or caterium ingots. Caterium has by far the best ratio, but it requires caterium, which I don't really recommend using. Basic recipe obviously involves copper, which is a 1:2 ratio, which is not that bad at all. However, I will be using something called iron wire for this example, which, as you can probably guess, requires iron ingots to make the wire. Using this recipe to make the 60 wire, we only need 33.4 iron ingots, which of course is 33.4 iron ore, unless you use the pure ingot recipe, but there's a reason as to why I haven't, and that will be discussed in just a moment. Moving over now to the second part of the recipe, we've got steel pipes, and again, as you can see, we are only using iron. This is not a mistake on my part, it's just a really cool alternate recipe. This is called iron pipe. With this recipe, you can again convert all of your iron ingots into steel pipes. There's no copper, there's no coal, there's nothing else involved other than iron. And that's how we end up with this recipe, which might sound again really complex. Steel pipes and a wire, you might be thinking there's no way on earth I want to be doing that. But now that we've done all these alternate recipes, you can see you can just use iron. But does this actually save you on iron? Let's double check here, because as we can see, this requires 113.4 iron ore, whereas the basic recipe requires 112.5. So in reality, if you're trying to save on time, trying to find different nodes, resources, and everything else really, the basic recipe should be the best. Except I wasn't convinced. So I've gone ahead and done some extra research where I've calculated the rough power usage that you're going to require, which is again roughly 97 megawatts of power. You are then going to be needing 3 assemblers, 9 constructors, and 4 smelters to again make the basic rotor recipe. Whereas for the alternate recipe, the one that requires the steel rotors, only need 62 megawatts of power, which is less than the first one, 2 assemblers, which again, less than the basic, 4 constructors, which is less than the basic, and 4 smelters, which is the exact same. So you're using about 1 or maybe 2 extra iron ore per minute, but you're saving on a bunch of power and space, which means that you can make this into a much more compact blueprint design if you so wish. So originally, I would have said the basic recipe was the best one, but after conducting our research, I must say, I much prefer the steel rotor recipe, which just uses iron ore. Of course, it uses less power, less assemblers, and less constructors as well, which is great for saving space. Additionally, you don't have to be messing around with 250 screws per minute, because both of these two chaps fit onto Mark 1 conveyor belts completely fine. However, you are going to need a Mark 2 conveyor belt if you want to do this, because of course 80 is more than 60, unless of course you could just split it 40 and 40, so 40 iron ingots makes 10 steel pipes, which I'm sure is a lot easier just to use Mark 1 belts there. So to conclude, with all the evidence we found out today, I am going to be saying that the steel rotor alternate recipe, whilst using these alternate recipes, is the best rotor recipe in Satisfactory 1.0. Also, as a very quick experiment on the channel, if you made it this far into the video, comment down the word fun. It's just a quick experiment for me to try and see how many people do watch to the end, if I should make my video shorter or longer. It's just a quick experiment. Regardless, thank you very much for watching today's video. But before we go, a massive thank you to our members, Mau Mau, Skull and Hattie, Lo, Nitormal, Heroes Rising, Cutthroat Zoo, Yamikel, and Tio Rico.